Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first of a 5 webinar series for the Katz Innovation Webinars. My name is Yael Keller, and I work with Mike Urim at Penn Hillel and with Dan Smokler at the Office of Innovation for the SIC on this exciting initiative. The webinar series is the next step of what we all started at HIGA this December, but is also more broadly a space to for professionals like you guys to create new ideas, to scheme and dream together and create a community. So we are really excited to see both returning summiteers and also some new faces here. Welcome to everybody. If you would like information on the rest of the series, please, and did not receive an email from me, please feel free to email me at ykeller@pennhillel.org, and I'm happy to send you the flyer with the remaining 4 sessions, which will take place throughout April and May at this time. I would now like to turn it over to Rabbi Mike Urim. Mike is the founding director of the Steinhardt Center for Jewish Innovation and is also the executive director of Penn Hillel for the last 14 years. So I'm sure he knows many of you and needs no further introduction. We are really excited to learn from you today, Mike, and I'll turn it over.
Great, thank you, Yael. So welcome everybody. We have, we're gonna have fun, we're gonna go quick, we're gonna hopefully make this super interesting and relevant. And my theory about all this stuff is if for some reason it's not super interesting or relevant, we should just do something that is. The only purpose of this is that it works for folks. Take a look in the chat boxes. There are copies of the full slides and also like note-taking slides. So you can download those and have them and use them in whatever way is helpful. And I want to actually begin, if it's okay, with like some mention of Pesach, because I think if you're anything like me, there's so much preparation and food stuff related to Passover and programmatic stuff at Hillel that sometimes I forget to think about and enjoy what the holiday is really all about. And I think, you know, one of the tirades that I've been on for many years is to help students move away from the idea that every Jewish holiday is, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, that it's all about commemorating the past. And Pesach is one of these great holidays where, in addition to retelling the story, it's really about how the story applies to our lives today. And so one of the great questions, again, I don't think this is like a huge new idea, but it was an idea that was new to me when I met a certain professor in college, where he said it's not about asking, just about remembering how we were freed from slavery, but asking the question, if we were able to be freed from slavery in Egypt, what is it today that we need to be freed from? What is it today that we are enslaved to? And I'm sure that there are a lot of personal and spiritual and value-based things that we could think about, both in terms of our own personal slavery, but also for other groups of people in our world. But instead of delving into all of those deep ideas, I want to just have a shallow application to the topic today, which is, I think, one of the things that we are enslaved to in the professional Jewish sector is bad language. We have really bad language to talk about what we do, to talk about the types of Jews that we're trying to reach. And there's all of this neuroscience that shows that the way we speak has dramatic impact on the way that we think. In fact, there's theory that says you can't think of something unless you can articulate it verbally. But even on a more basic level, the more careful and thoughtful and intentional we are about the language we use, the more likely our strategy is to get tight and clean and more high impactful. So what we're going to do is, for about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, I'm going to take you through a couple of basic ideas, and then we're going to actually ask you to apply these new terms and categories to yourself and your own Jewish identity, to the work that you do, and to see if any of this is applicable and about how we can change and innovate and reach more Jews in a more powerful way. Sound good? Okay. If it's boring, just like pretend to yawn on your video camera, and then I'll realize that like I'm not hitting, and we'll just do something better, right? I'll tell bad jokes or something. And also, for anyone else who's not doing video, it's super awkward to be on the video, and like I feel like if we do it, you have to do it. So Anne, Ronit, Mara, I'm pointing people out here left and right. Allison, Ari, and Talia, if you guys want to, you can be awkward just like us. There you go. Welcome in. Okay. You can still multitask. No one will know. Just type quietly. Okay. So now I'm going to share my screen with you. And this is the PowerPoint presentation that I attached. And this is something that we started at the Katz Innovation Summit together at HIGA, and people wanted to go deeper on it. So I just want to reframe the idea. This slide is really meant to highlight some of what I think is the dangerous or misleading language that we use in the organized Jewish community, which is we say things like the Jewish community. Hillel students or Hillel presidents think about that they represent the entire Jewish community on campus, or that the Hillel community represents the entire Jewish community on campus. And federations and JCCs and synagogues also make these mistakes all the time. Synagogues talk about the congregation. The Philadelphia Federation, until recently, I think their motto was one community, one campaign, one federation, or something like that. And the problem with that is we know in reality it's not one community. It is a series of networks, and that not all the networks are the same. They don't all have the same Jewish interests or backgrounds. And by talking about the community and who's in the community and out of the community, it creates a binary language that A, doesn't really help us have a strategy for how to reach people who don't feel like they're part of the community. But it also, I think, reinforces a sense that you're either in or you're out. And like, I think we see this maybe most poignantly around Israel stuff, that if all we talk about in terms of Israel engagement is, are you pro-Israel or not pro-Israel? And you don't feel exactly like those pro-Israel types because you're struggling or you have questions. So then the only alternative we've offered folks in terms of our language is to then be not pro-Israel. And I think the same thing happens with the Jewish community. Are you a Hillel person or not a Hillel person? And the truth is it's way more nuanced. And I don't know if you guys have experiences like this, but I always laugh how everybody at Penn Hillel feels like they're not involved in Penn Hillel. You know, the kids in the Orthodox community who are here 8 hours a day, every day, they're not really Hillel kids because they're just in the Orthodox community. And the pro-Israel kids who spend 40 hours a week doing pro-Israel stuff, they're not really Hillel. And this is totally true. A bunch of years ago, a woman by the name of Naomi Kaplan was president of Penn Hillel, and she said, I'm not really one of the Hillel kids. And so again, it's like that's the brittleness of that language. The Jewish community doesn't really help us. I think the two other pieces are that there are certain dirty words. They're not really that dirty, but by being a little bit facetious and a little bit hyperbolic about it, I think it drives home an important point. Words like affiliated, involved, showing up, attending, words even like program, I think that they are problematic because even though we might in theory mean something more complicated, what ends up happening is these all betray a certain bias. And the bias is that we measure Jews based on the degree to which they do what we want them to do, which in theory would be Jewish, right? But in reality, it's to show up. It's to be part of our programs. It's to be part of our organization. And so every time we say it was an amazing welcome back barbecue, we had more people than we've ever had before. A huge number of people showed up. It was a great way to get involved. We keep essentially going back that our core operating value is getting people to show up. And I think that engagement and Jewish innovation and the transformation of people's Jewish lives happens when we invert the values pyramid. And instead of starting with what Hillel needs, or the synagogue needs, or the federation needs, we have to start with what individual Jews need. So the reason to affiliate, the reason to get involved, the reason to attend a program is because it makes a difference in their lives, because it builds, it creates Jewish friendships. It increases Jewish knowledge. It increases Jewish self-confidence. It helps college students grow into adult Jews. And I think that if we can use different language, we can be a little bit more laser focused on the deeper set of mission goals and value goals that are really animating the work that we do. And the final thing I think we need to get rid of is much of the language we use in the Jewish community really ends up measuring people on these linear spectrums: involved, uninvolved, core, periphery, religious, not religious, practicing Jew, not practicing Jew. And most of the terms, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, right, pro-Israel, not pro-Israel, most of those terms are not measuring Judaism or things that are deeply valued Jewish things. They're measuring affiliation, right? Whether you show up, whether you come, whether you're active. And again, I think we're trying to do something more nuanced. So instead of trying to get people to show up, we're trying to help people grow Jewishly. we measure success both in the numbers of people that we reach, which again is an active verb as opposed to show up, which is more of a passive verb, right? But we measure it not just by how many people we reach, but by what happens when we reach them, right? So if, imagine your Hillel was lucky enough to get Gal Gadot to come, right? And you could get every Jew on campus to show up at some incredible mega event with, you know, Wonder Woman. The most cursory surface measure of success is how many students you get. And then it's really about a deeper set of questions. Good? So I'm happy to pause for a sec if there's any questions or comments. I'm happy to take them we did kind of all the negatives before I go on to what some alternatives are for how we can talk about this. Are there any kind of questions or comments that people want to share now, either through the audio or through chat? Okay, good. You can interrupt me if something else comes up that you realize you want to do. So the first piece of nomenclature, we shared this a little bit with people at Higa, is to, instead of thinking about all Jews as the same and measuring them based on how close or far they are from Hillel or from Israel or from coming to Minyan or whatever Jewish thing you want to plug in there, that another way to think about the Jews on campus is in two large buckets. And I realize that two large buckets is never going to be nuanced or descriptive enough to really capture everybody. And yet it's still, even with all those imperfections, much better than putting everyone in one bucket, right? So in other words, like the people who come to Hillel and the people who don't come to Hillel, that I think is the dangerous language. The language we've developed at Penn Hillel is based on old Richard Joel language from the 90s, which is that all Jews are either empowerment Jews or engagement Jews. And what Richard meant by that back in the day was empowerment Jews were people who came to Hillel, and engagement Jews were Jews who didn't go to Hillel. It's basically the same thing as involved and uninvolved. What we've done at Penn to kind of develop that language is that, and the language isn't perfect, but the descriptions, I think, are actually deeper than the terms themselves. But the description is that engagement and empowerment Jews really describe like deep orientations that people have with respect to how they relate to Judaism. It talks about their Jewish story. It talks about what kind of Jewish friend network they have. And so you can see on this slide here that the essential piece here is that empowerment Jews spend lots of time with other Jews where they live, work, and play. A lot more Jewish friends. They live in the more Jewishy neighborhoods in a city. You know, an empowerment Jew will find their social group and connection in Hillel, in Jewish fraternities, in Jewish a cappella groups, whatever it is, as opposed to an engagement Jew, which might, you know, instead of pledging a Pi, they might be in Sigma Chi, right? Instead of being in SDT sorority or Alpha Phi, they might be in Tri Delt. And the other thing is that empowerment Jews tend to seek out Jewish opportunities to participate. So these are the kids who show up at Hillel because they need kosher food, because they love Jewish community, because their parents told them to. Engagement Jews are less likely to seek out organized Jewish community. I think here's the key, is if they do show up, they often have a bad experience, right? So maybe an example of this for Hillel would be the huge crowd that you might get the first Friday night back at the beginning of the school year. And then a lot of those people who show up feel like they don't fit in, they don't know anyone, they don't know all the insider language, they don't necessarily know all the Jewish rituals in the way that they should. And instead of it being a positive thing, showing up at Hillel that one time, it actually reinforces their negative feelings that they have about the organized Jewish community. The third major distinction is about Jewish resume. Empowerment Jews have long organizational resumes. They know all the acronyms, USY, NCSY, NIFTY. They know APAC and J Street. And engagement Jews feel just as Jewish, but they don't feel like they need Jewish institutions in order to enact that Judaism. They are more interested in enacting their Judaism in private, smaller, more intimate settings. They feel like their Jewish identity is immutable. It doesn't matter what they do. They are just as Jewish as everybody else. But more than anything else, they just don't know all the acronyms and they don't really care. And so it's interesting as you think about all the fighting that we do about J Street and APAC and JVP and who's in the tent and out of the tent. these are things that keep empowerment Jews up at night. And these are things that engagement Jews don't know exist. So the expression, oh my gosh, did you read that article in the forward about BDS? Literally sounds like Greek to an engagement Jew. They don't know what BDS is, they don't know what the forward is, and they don't care. And so I think that betrays two important qualities. One is that we have to be careful about the language we use because it can be inherently exclusive, even when we're not talking about Hebrew or ritual things, just like Jewish community things, and saying like shmooze and kibbutz and whatever else it is, right? I think those can be exclusionary. And the second thing is if we end up spending a huge amount of time navigating insider baseball,
there's so many like speakers or like that.
All of that energy, while it may seem super important to the empowerment Jews, is just taking away from our ability to engage Jews who are more on the engagement side of this column. Okay? It looks like there's a chat maybe that popped up. Let me just see for a sec. Okay. Okay, just a reminder to put on mute. Great. So I think that those are the main categories of engagement and empowerment Jews. You can see, generally speaking, empowerment Jews do show up when they want something, and engagement Jews show up when they need something. This is more for like a synagogue version of this, but in other words, I think empowerment Jews tend to, for Hillel modes, come like, well, I'm looking for like a conservative service. I'm looking for traditional egalitarian davening. And they won't like Hillel because, and they'll be able to say like, oh, it's too reform here, and I'm not into guitars on Shabbos and Debbie Friedman songs. And an engagement Jew will show up at Hillel, and they don't necessarily know what they want, and they'll say like, oh, the vibe was just weird. And it's not, again, that they're ignorant, it's just that they don't have the organizational nomenclature to describe what they didn't like. And if you ask an engagement Jew what they want, they'll probably say to you, no, I'm good, I'm fine. Like I feel really Jewish, and I went on birthright, and my grandparents have a Seder every year and I love it. Empowerment Jews, you can ask them what they want and they'll be able to tell you, good and bad, and they'll be the ones who get, politically annoying and kvetchy within the organization. Engagement Jews have to be activated, and they have to be paired in an almost concierge way with the next Jewish experience, because they're not going to seek it out for themselves because they feel good, right? Okay. Any questions before I move on to the next category of language that we use? Just jump in, unmute yourself, or type it in chat.
I have just a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you give us like 2 sentences on why you chose the word empowerment and the word engagement for these 2 categories of Jews?
Yeah, that's the weakest part of this whole thing. I chose it. I didn't choose it is the right answer. We used it because Richard Joel used to use it, and then we just thought those definitions that Richard used to use were silly because it was just replicating involved and uninvolved, and so we just kept this nomenclature and then added nuance to it. But the problem with the language, I mean, what Richard meant by it was empowerment Jews were ready to be empowered. In other words, don't worry about the kids who come to Hill. Give them the resources, they'll do it for themselves. Engagement Jews need engagement to get active. And there is some truth to that there is a different way to reach Jews with long organizational resumes, which is, I think, about empowerment and about letting them use Hillel as a learning laboratory, because the goal of what we want to teach them is how to be Jewish leaders on their own, right? It's not to come to Hillel for Shabbos meals necessarily, but we want them to be hosting Shabbos meals for the rest of their lives, right? We don't want to do Israel advocacy for them. We want them to learn how to be Israel advocates on their own. So there is some language there about empowerment. And engagement Jews are Jews that are probably not going to grow a whole lot in college Jewishly unless we go out and get them and activate them in some way. I think part of what's weak about this, though, is that everyone's an engagement Jew, right? If we don't help empowerment, if student leaders grow Jewishly and all they do is plan a boatload of programs over 4 years and fight BDS, and we don't help them grow into Jewish adulthood, we've also failed. So there's also part of me that wants to say, I think everyone's an engagement Jew. Someone asked about what it means to have engagement Jews to be activated. I think what it means is there's a community organizing piece here. And in community organizing language, there's terms like activate or agitate. the best analogy I know of is like from early feminism, right? The early feminists had to go and do consciousness raising, and they would do these small parlor meetings with other women. Basically, like you couldn't change the world unless you helped women realize that they were oppressed, that they didn't have choices, that there were too many women out there who felt like it was great to just be a stay-at-home homemaker, and that the man's in charge, and the man's in charge of the money, and that's just the way it's always been. And so I think that a lot of engagement Jews feel that way about Judaism, which is they're proud to be Jewish. They don't feel like they know how to get connected or involved or how to activate their Judaism or to live out their Judaism in a richer way. But they don't feel a lot of angst about it because they are already in college and they already have this sense of, well, they'll say things like, I'm not that Jewish, right? And they're not necessarily beating themselves up. What they're really saying, I think, is, I don't know a whole lot, I don't do a whole lot, and I'm okay with it because that's how my parents were, that's how my grandparents were. But what we've found is if you get them to tell deeper versions of their Jewish story, that what comes out is all sorts of baggage and angst and guilt. It's usually in the categories of like guilt and insecurity and anger and baggage, and then pride and interest and a kind of a default sense that Judaism's cool. And where the breakdown normally happens is if you're trying to get engagement Jews to show up at empowerment programs or in empowerment communities, it's a huge barrier to involvement because they don't want to leave their friend groups and go and be with the Hillel kids. What they want is to feel Jewish and do Jewish things in their own universe. And so the part of what these two sets of terms teaches us is that empowerment Jews often are engaged in kind of larger macro communities that have formal leaders and participants and that are organizational, like Hillel or Federation or a synagogue. But empowerment engagement Jews require much more customization, much more micro community work where people are doing this in groups of 10 or 15, and there's no geographic boundaries in the engagement stuff, right? So Hillel happens at Hillel, but engagement can happen in the fraternity house or the sorority house or the dorm or the office of the student newspaper. And I think that the fullest model of this is to do both, to both have macro community and micro community. So sometimes I feel like Hillel has lost this message, which is like, we don't ever need to get people together. We just need to have them all in these little pockets. And I think one of the analogies that I've learned in speaking about the book over the past year is that most of what the adult Jewish community does is in the paradigm of the high holidays. Big, large groups of people. Success is measured by how many people show up at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It's run by professionals. Everyone else is kind of a passive client. But there is another paradigm in Judaism, which is Passover, which is the Passover Seder. Everyone does it in micro communities. It's totally customizable because you as the Seder leader know who's going to be there, right? And it's based on who you are and who's going to be there, and you do it your own way. And yet no one feels like you're destroying the Jewish community by not showing up 2,000 other people to have Seder. But I actually think just like the calendar needs both high holidays and Passover, I think programmatically in terms of how we create and encourage communities to form, we need both the high holiday model. You can't see my good hand motions here. The high holiday model and the Seder model. Cool? Okay. So I don't want to talk too long. I want to just show you this last thing, and then we're going to, and I would really love to ask people to stay in the call when we break into groups, because there's actually like an assessment. I want to ask people to figure out where you fit in the engagement empowerment divide, where your team fits, where your Hillel fits. And then there's this other thing called the model of multiple Jewish intelligences. And there's actually an assessment, a really quick one that you can take on the phone today. And then we'll be able to process all this stuff. Cool? So you guys, can you still see my screen? Let me go back to the screen share. Okay.
Now we can, yeah.
Okay. So this is, I totally made this idea up out of nowhere. Very smart people told me not to include it in the book, that it was bullshit. But I think it's good bullshit. And, you know, it may be bullshit, but I think it's good bullshit. And basically my idea was, I was thinking about the way that taking the Myers-Briggs personality assessment changed the way I thought about things. You know, if you've ever done it with your team, you know, you find out if people are highly introverted or highly extroverted. It's not just that you don't like parties or you're antisocial. It's that you might be more introverted in the way that you, or here's a better example. You have a staff meeting and there are certain people who dominate the brainstorming sessions and certain people who are silent. And you think, oh, the people who are silent, they're not team players, they're not leaning in, they don't have leadership potential. But maybe they're just introverted and they need a minute to think without talking, when other people on your team, the only way they learn and talk is by, the only way that they learn and think is by talking and by being extroverted. So sometimes having these categories that don't judge people, but that say that people fundamentally process the same experience in different ways, can help add nuance. And then I added to this the idea of multiple intelligences that exist in the education world. And the idea that, like, you know, if you're a teacher and, hold on one sec. Okay. Okay. So that if you're a teacher and like the teachers you love the most and that work the best for you are these amazing dynamic lecturers. And so as a teacher, you replicate that. And you can't understand why certain students in the classroom are not learning effectively just from your frontal lecture. It's that there are multiple intelligences, right? There are people who are auditory learners and visual learners and tactile learners. And so I think that the same thing applies to how people understand religion. It's not just Judaism, honestly, it's religion in general. And that sometimes the reason people love showing up in shul or love Seder or love tradition or love Israel advocacy or love community service isn't just their own distinct preferences, but actually may get deeper into how they process religion. And so what I did is I made up 4 different dichotomies. Again, all of these have Jewish traditional expressions. So they're all equally Jewish and they're all, none of them are weaker or stronger, involved or uninvolved. They're just, you know, different versions of this. So the Jewish version of communal is a minyan, right? Praying in public. The Jewish version of being private is hitbodedut, which is a Hasidic practice of going and encountering God in a solitary way. And without going too crazy into all this, I think the question when you take the survey is to think about what types of settings turn you on the most, right? It doesn't have to just be Jewish. It could be everything. Like, would you rather see your favorite band at a stadium with 50,000 other people? That might make you more communal and public. Or is your dream to like see your favorite band in like the smallest little bar or coffee shop, right? Or you actually enjoy music the best when you're alone, just listening like with your earbuds. The same thing could, you know, is the most powerful Jewish moment you can imagine being at AIPAC with like 20,000 other people, or standing at high holidays with thousands of other people hearing the shofar blow? Or is it like lighting Shabbos candles with your family or studying one-on-one with a person? And you can imagine the same things for formal versus improvisational, which just means like, I think the other language I use is fixed, but like, do you like routine or do you like improvisation, right? If you were to get married, do you pick the ketubah that is just like the ones that your parents and your grandparents or your great-grandparents had, and that's your core animating value? Or is it that you want to reinvent the ketubah to make it fit for who you are, right? Same thing at your Seder. Is the Seder to make sure to read every word and to keep the tradition alive? Or is the Seder all about reinventing it so it's relevant today? Ethnic and universal is the same thing. And here it's really important. I assume everybody is both ethnic and universal. But I think the question is to ask, what's your primary motivation Jewishly, right? Think back to the first thing that animated your Jewish identity. For me, it was that my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. So I have lots of feelings about how Judaism should influence the world. But at the end of the day, it really does all come back to the ethnic for me. And so again, you can think about Seder. Is the main purpose of Seder to tell the story of the Jewish people? Or is the main purpose of the Seder to apply it to, you know, workers' rights and to people who are being sex trafficked and all the other people who are enslaved today, right? And then the final one is thinking versus feeling. Again, very obvious. This actually comes right from the Myers-Briggs. But there are people who, you know, you take 2 people to meet the same educator, and the one person's like, ugh, way too touchy-feely for me. I need something intellectual. And the other person's like, I love that. I like roll with the touchy-feely. So again, just to think about who you are, like, do you begin to engage in things that feel inspirational with your head or with your heart? So let me stop the screen share here and just take a quick minute for questions. and then we're going to break you into breakout groups to actually start to take these assessments. Any quick questions, just for clarification here at this point? I can't see if you guys were yawning through the presentation because I can only see my screen, but hopefully people are engaged. Okay, so let's do this. What we're going to do is, I think to really do this, you have to go get the slides that we linked, and it looks like Julie just posted them again, which is totally awesome, in the chat box. And Ari will take it easy. It's nice to see you. And what we're going to ask people to do is to think both about the empowerment engagement and then also to take this assessment of the multiple Jewish intelligences. And in your group, just play around with this. There are guiding questions about where your Hillel is strong and where your Hillel is weak, like what it would look like if you tried to build out more for this other group of Jews. But essentially the whole idea here is that one of the mistakes that we make with engagement is we do things that are one size fits all. And I don't mean that it's really, people get defensive when I say that, but what I mean is, even if you have Israel stuff and community service stuff and Shabbos stuff and different prayer options, it can be one size fits all still, because if it's all empowerment Jews creating Jewish opportunities for other empowerment Jews that uses the same assumptions and the same organizing principles and the same kind of language, it's still one size fits all, whether it's Jewish softball or Jewish Israel advocacy. And so I'll just give you one example. You think about multiple Jewish intelligences and Israel. Most of what we do related to Israel is highly ethnic and highly public, right? We're not doing a lot of stuff, my guess is, any of us, synagogues, federations, or Hillels, that is private or universal. So like, what would that look like to start to offer ways to engage with Israel where the primary motivation is not how do we protect the Jews in Israel, but how do we use Israel and Zionism as a way to advance a kind of universal set of values to change the entire world, right? It would yield maybe a whole different way of doing Israel engagement. That's the kind of work I want to have people spend about 15 or 20 minutes playing with in their small groups. Honestly, I don't care where you go other than it's interesting. But I think in the small groups, take the first few minutes to figure out in what ways are you like an engagement Jew, in what ways are you like an empowerment Jew, and then to take the multiple Jewish intelligences assessment. And then in each group, then start to play around with that. You can use the guiding questions I offer, or whatever kind of comes up that's interesting in the groups. Good? What came up, guys? Let's just play with this. We got 10 minutes. I'm really interested to hear, like, if there were places where, like, you're like, nice idea, totally not applicable. This blew my mind because I never thought about my own Judaism this way. This is all awesome, but there's no way we can do any of this because we don't have enough staff or money. Like, let's just, whatever comes up, but like someone ask something controversial to the group and let's get the conversation going. Boring. Come on, someone say something offensive.
Okay, I cannot promise that this is going to be offensive,
Okay.
but I would like to have more conversation about the ethnic versus universal question. And I offered in my group that perhaps I'm like so far on the ethnic realm of things that I like don't even get what to be a universal kind of person would mean. Mm-hmm. But I would love to hear more from people who identify more with that and just like help me understand what that means.
Okay, so let's take a couple other comments too, and then we'll start to play with it. Other things people want to talk about or respond to?
So likewise, the formal versus improvisational is how was coming to mind for me. So I think I'm agreeing with Maggie on the ethnic versus universal point there, so I won't repeat that. But the formal versus improvisational, I think it's easier for all forms of Jews to think about Judaism in terms of formal, whereas the improvisational is where a lot of people might find the deeper connections that they're not finding that are keeping them unengaged. And I'm just percolating a little bit on like, what do we do about that? How do we teach people to think about improvisational Judaism when actually they might also just be more comfortable with the formal?
Wait, so you're saying someone who might be like cognitively more on the improvisational side of the spectrum, but yet all of their training is that Judaism is only a formal thing. And so even though they might be happier if they did improvisational, they can't even begin to contemplate it because everything else is so steeped in the formal.
Right.
Okay.
I'll even try to draw a real life example for you from my Passover Seders is I can tell that I'm sitting in a room with my similar age cousins, and they're going to come to Seder no matter what, because they understand that they should come formally to a Passover Seder every year, but they're completely unengaged and uninterested in our Seder. And it's actually holding me back from enjoying, because I just feel this energy in the room of not wanting to be there. And so I can sense that they want the Seder, and they would actually potentially even be more interested in thinking improvisationally about what to do with a Seder. But we're so attached to our tradition, which I think connects to the ethnic part as well, that we're not breaking free of it. And I'm afraid about what next generation looks like when I look at Judaism through that lens.
Yeah. So I want to take more questions and comments, because I think that you stumbled upon an important point that I wanted to amplify also, if that's okay, which is, I think that part of what you're talking about is also the engagement versus the empowerment divide. And I think that empowerment Jews are Jews who want to and are self-directed, like sit through the thing or find meaning in the thing, right? Or maybe feel empowered enough to know that if it's boring, then I should not just dislike it, but I should do something to make it meaningful. And I think engagement Jews don't feel empowered to do those things or to think those ways. And so again, I think it betrays, what I like about that language is that it betrays not just that there's different Jewish worlds, but that they require a different style of Jewish engagement. I know we're using the word engagement too much, but you know what I'm saying? And so in other words, empowerment Jews are the kind of Jews you can say, well, this is the chance to, like, we're going to break into groups and read this part of the Haggadah and say, like, what does this bring up for you? While the engagement Jew is like, I don't really want to be here. I just feel like guilty if I'm not going to be here. And so I think what we actually have to do is, like, very intentionally and consciously both agitate them and say, like, well, what do you want? This is bullshit to be here, but to not like it, right? You have better things to do with your time. And part of our job in the 4 years you're in college is to help you get over that kind of guilt baggage and to move towards a place, right, where you are choosing things out of a position of strength and power, but also to help model. It's like, you're not just teaching, like, what do the words of the Haggadah say, but what are some tools to take words that seem to be meaningless and make them meaningful and relevant. It's it's like for engagement Jews, it might be like, I heard an interesting interpretation about the 4 children that were really all of them. In engagement, you might need something really differently, which is, why would you even try to transpose 4 children to something modern? Right? Okay. I realize we're a little...
I mean, on the flip side, there's the question of, like, how much formal do you need to get to the improvisational? Like, in order to play jazz, you need to know the rules you need to know chord progressions. Right.
No, so I think that's an important thing, right? I think the formal versus improvisational, it doesn't mean that, like, it's not that one way to be Jewish is to not know how to play the instrument and just, like, bang, you're playing drums on the guitar, right? And the other is that you've learned all the chords. I think in theory, we're going to help everyone learn how to play the instrument. But the question is, once you have capacity to do it and skills, I honest to goodness think that there are people who, look, my wife wakes up every morning and her routine makes her feel happy and centered and organized. And honestly, I wish I had no routine ever. Like, I hate brushing my teeth. Every night I brush my teeth and I'm like, it's so unfair. I have to do this every night. You know what I mean? Like, and so I feel more alive when I'm living spontaneously. And so again, if you put me in a band, I do play guitar, but if you put me in a band, I'm, like, way more interested in jamming and improvising blues, even though I spent all the time to learn all that stuff, than I am in, like, being part of, like, a huge orchestra where I'm one of 300 parts fitting myself into the larger whole. Right? I do actually, part of why I like traditional Judaism is because it's so counter to my nature that I feel like there is, like, a purification ritual that goes on. Forcing myself to pray every day the same words is so against my nature that I feel like, you know, I'm so far in the improvisational thing that I feel like I need to beat it out of myself to teach myself to be more formal and fixed, because I have no discipline. I mean, naturally, I have no discipline, right? Okay. So I think that the one last thing I want to say about the formal versus improvisational, I think I don't know always what it means for a Hillel. Maybe I do, but the way that I thought about this is like a really big critique of synagogues, which is synagogues measure their success by their membership and by how many people come to services and how many people come to the classes they offer. And I think the idea here is that if our mission is Judaism and not just Hillel, in our strategic planning, we should have ways to encourage, to measure, and to grow the number of Jews who act both, I think it tends to be like both public and formal, and both private and improvisational. So it's success when people show up in Hill and have a big Shabbos dinner and do formal Kiddush and formal Birkat Hamazon. But it's also success when people have small Shabbos dinners where they don't say Kiddush and they say, like, let's go around the room at Shabbat and say, like, what they're appreciative this week, right? Or I think about synagogues. It's like if synagogues should have a strategy for getting people to light Shabbos candles and to bless their children, traditionally or not traditionally, right? Or to put money in a tzedakah box right before Shabbos dinner as a way of remembering that we are all so blessed and we have more than we need and we actually have enough to give back, right? In addition to the number of Jews who come Shabbos morning or Friday night to services. And I think the problem is that because institutions are focused on institutional expressions of Judaism, Hillels, JCCs, federations, synagogues, all of us end up focusing more on only really caring about what happens when people show up in Jewish spaces. And that the improvisational piece, I think, is the key to helping people. And I think 75% of American Jews are never going to really want to spend a lot of time in formal Jewish spaces. They're never going to just love the high holiday model. They're going to need the Seder model. And so I think what we got to do is figure out how to complement all of the kind of high holiday model stuff we do, right? The big speaker, it's great that we have big speakers come to campus and speak to 200 people about Israel. But what's the kind of private improvisational version of that, right? And I think the improvisational version is find a group of Jews who never come to Hillel, who live together, who party together, who play sports together, but have never had a Jewish conversation together, and activate them so that all of a sudden they're having a Shabbat dinner and they're saying, like, when you think about Israel, what things come up in your mind, right? And so you're taking a micro community that already exists and empowering them to have an Israel conversation, right? Again, it may not be the answer, but I do believe it's tangibly more Jewish engagement than nothing. And in some ways, it might actually be richer Jewish engagement than showing up and hearing, whoever speak, because instead of it being passive and them being on their phone, they're actually talking to each other and they realize, holy crap, my baseline assumption is when I think of Israel, I think of home and like the family trip we took. And when I think and yet all my friends think of Israel only as, controversial. I don't want to talk about it because it's the thing that my grandparents fight about at Passover, right? That's like deep consciousness raising in a group of friends. Or Hillel's job is to convene Jewish students who don't have any Jewish friends in small micro communities, because we all get to look at our Facebook feeds and hear about what's happening when Israel's bombing in Gaza. But people who don't have real life Jewish friends also tend not to have Facebook or Instagram friends who are posting a lot of Israel stuff. So there's no place for them to process that stuff in real life or in cyberspace. Wow, that's an old term. That's social media. Dial up on their modems and access the internet. Anyway, okay. Guys, I want to be respectful of time. I hope this was provocative. Obviously, an hour is not enough to figure this all out. But what I would say is that my hope is, my feeling about all this stuff is that by thinking about our work differently with different language, even though it's just nudgy to do it, what it can actually do is I think it can help us all do more of what we want to do, right? I think most of us want to do more and reach more people and reach people in deeper ways, but we feel like the day-to-day grind of all of the work we have to do and the crazy amount of hours and all the holidays and it burns us out. And I think part of the way that we get better at it and we stay inspired is by thinking about it from a different perspective. And my theory is that both time and energy are deeply elastic. So the truth is, I don't think we should say work more hours to do more, but that if you have a little bit of space where you figure out some other things that you want to do as an organization, you can usually do them without a lot more money and time, because what you do is you just find a way to truncate everything else. You just find a way, like if you have 3 hours to do your email, it'll take 3 hours. If you have to do it in 2, usually you'll find a way to prioritize, and some stuff won't get done perfectly, but you'll have room to engage, 20 more Jewish students or 100 more Jewish students. And I think that that's better, right? It's better for us not to be perfect on email or to have every gift bag that we're packaging for Passover to be perfect, and to have time to be able to reach new students in new ways. So I think that inspiration is the way that we drive this stuff, not by saying, how do we fit more? We don't have enough time or enough money already. How do we fit more? I think it's like, holy crap, what about those private Jews and those improvisational Jews? And then you just do it. And then you realize something else gets forgotten, but in the end, the Hillel could actually be stronger. So I hope that this is enough, at least, to get your wheels churning, and knowing that this might not be the right answer or the right nomenclature. Then the question is, what's the right nomenclature for your campus, for your organization? You'll figure it out. You'll do it better than we did it. And that'll be good for the whole Hillel system. So thank you guys for joining.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mike, for such an amazing kickoff to the series. I just want to remind everyone that if you like today, there's more to come. On Tuesday, April 24th at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, Rabbi Josh Bolton will talk about identity percolation, the role of coffee dating for engagement. So we hope that you'll grab a cup of coffee and meet us on the 24th at 12 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.